All right. Well, we're welcoming Robert Villa, um, currently a long-term president of the Tucson Herpetological Society, which was founded, what, 1987? And it is the expression world renowned, but it is. I mean, it's done all supported our reptiles and amphibians, collectively known as herps, our herpofauna. Herpofauna, is that pronounced correctly?
Yep.
Herpofauna, herps. All the research, they have grants going out for research. They've really done a lot to protect these wonderful creatures that we all enjoy watching. And he is also a research associate, is that correct?
Yep.
The lab at Tumamoc Hill, which is another wonderful, many of us, I'm sorry, I'm letting people in, wonderful location in Tucson, very historic. It was founded in 1902 by botanists from the Department of Agriculture, if I'm correct.
Yeah, and the New York Botanical Garden.
New York Botanical, and is it Carnegie
Yeah.
Institute?
Well,
Carnegie Institute?
yep. The
Please.
Carnegie, yes, they founded it. Yeah.
Two things I want to say about that. One is that it is the home of ecology. It's where ecology was founded, so to speak. And also Ellie Spaulding. I want to bring up the female botanist who was a botanist in her own right and married to the director Spaulding. Um, what was his first name? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But the main thing is she was the botanist that discovered how saguaros drink and store water. And there's a photograph of her sitting on the arm of a saguaro with a little wooden platform, I guess. Anyway,
Yep,
in her long dress from early 1900s.
that's a great photo. She actually, yeah, she was able to measure the swelling and contracting of saguaro ribs or saguaro pleats with rain.
Isn't that something to just be that patient and sit there in this thorny tree, so to speak?
Yeah, and well, and the new Green Planet series shows that they did a time lapse over 3 months looking at
Isn't it?
one saguaro.
Yeah, we were talking before we officially started the meeting about the Green Planet series with David Attenborough, and but earlier this month, right, early
Yep.
August, they featured the Sonoran Desert and Tumamoc, and Robert was involved along with I forgot his name,
Ben Wilder.
Ben
Yeah.
Wilder, who is not there anymore. I
No.
just read. Anyway, so anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Robert. He's going to talk about the future of our herps. I did look at that study, and it seems to me it really just didn't really know. I mean, we know that the heating planet will affect everything. So what do you know? And please just regale us with tales.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. I don't know how many people actually read the paper, but the title is, I mean, it's written by two colleagues of mine, Aaron Flesh and Phil Rosen, and the title is Long-Term Changes in Abundances of Sonoran Desert Lizards Reveal Complex Responses to Climate Migration. Is there any way of knowing how many people read this here in the discussion so that I don't want to speak down or I want to be able to answer questions about it appropriately.
Can we raise our hand? Is there a hand
Okay,
motion?
Kara did not. Okay.
Okay. I did, but that doesn't matter.
Okay. Well, okay. Well, I'll let people interrupt me if they have any questions. Actually,
You'll have to unmute yourself if that's okay, everyone.
I can attach the paper to the chat. I think I can. Let's see here.
I can do that while you talk.
Okay.
Yeah, I can do that.
Close that. So one of the reasons that this paper was even published was because Phil Rosen, who sadly is no longer with us. So Gigi, I believe Karen's gonna actually attach the paper itself to the chat. So um, one of the reasons that this paper was published was because Phil Rosen had 25 years of population data from several species of lizards. So two terrestrial ones, tiger whiptail, the desert spiny lizard, the zebra-tail lizard, the ornate tree lizard, the side-blotched lizard, and I think that's 5 species that they looked at. And it's really unusual to have 25 years of more or less consistent data on lizards like that, or any animal. As a matter of fact, it says that it's the longest, most complete set for vertebrates in the arid Southwest. And this data was temperature, the abundance of individual lizards, and when it was known, the age class: adult, subadult, juvenile, or neonate, which is neonates just recently born. And these transects, people would walk straight line transects and count the lizards and identify the lizards and all of that, up to 7.5 meters on either side of the specified length of that straight line transect. And these were correlated with weather stations. So rainfall and temperature, humidity, and all of those things. So there could be there would be climatic data to associate with lizard abundance. And in the Southwest, climate flux or climate change or climate variability, it stands out in starker contrast to other bioregions because resources are already very limited, and you're able to observe sort of, I guess, waves or ripple effects with specific weather events on the lizard populations because they're so abundant, and they depend on their food from winter rains, and predators depend on them during the spring and summer. So a change in lizard populations is going to theoretically show some changes in trophic levels or in prey abundance and so forth. I'm sure you've all have noticed this year and last year's monsoon season, there was a seasonal abundance of insect. Last monsoon season, we saw a spike in moths and butterflies and things like that. After previously being in at least 2, probably more years of drought. And we were looking at the effects of that, the time lag effects. You know, a lot of the butterflies or species of insects that we saw were species that were exceptionally adapted to arid conditions. So the diversity was low, maybe just a fewer species, but there was a higher abundance of butterflies. But what we didn't see was what we thought would be a correlated abundance of insect predators like birds and lizards and things like that. But we just didn't see that. And that's because the things that eat those insects suffered from the previous years of drought. There was no food. But in the desert, it turns out that for lizards, ectotherms, temperature does have an effect. It modulates behaviors and activities, but really water is the second most limiting factor. It's probably the most limiting factor. So as long as lizards have precipitation and water, they seem to be able to withstand all these fluctuations in temperatures. But of course, you know, that depends on whether we have a good year or a bad year of rain. The lizards that they chose for this study had a diversity of niches or jobs, if you will, in the neighborhood. So some lived in trees, some lived on the ground, some lived more in rocks. And all of these were affected by, in different ways, by the year-to-year fluctuations in climate. And so basically this paper says that they're complex responses to climate change, but for the most part, generally speaking, an increase in temperature has effects on activity, on reproduction, on the availability of food, the ability to locate mates. Because if you're dealing with increasing temperatures, if the lizards are being pushed to their physiological thresholds, whether it's extreme heat or even maximum low temperatures. I know that's kind of an oxymoron, but if they're experiencing cold temperatures that they haven't experienced before, all of those extremes are going to have significant effects on the abundance of those species. So it's not that these animals aren't adapted to extreme nutrient restricted environments. It's the degree that's pushing their typical thresholds. So, for example, you have lizards you have one group of lizards that reproduce in late winter and early fall, and so they're active during those periods of time, but the increase in yearly low winter season temperatures means that their numbers will go up. And so, but what that also means is that you have a correlated summer increase as well in heat. And those animals that are active in the summer, late spring, early summer months are just pushed to their extremes, and their populations actually go down. Let's do very small details that demonstrate that the change in temperature that these populations are experiencing is affecting lizards based on their specific habitat requirements and their thermal tolerances, and yeah, their habitats and what they do. But in general, increase in average temperatures across the year, across the seasons, combined with limited water, is having negative effects on lizard populations. Again, the reason this paper is so important is because we were able to make these observations based on 25 years of consistent data. and they acknowledge that, you know, there are a lot of variables to measure, and they attempted to measure a good amount of variables. But it's very difficult to quantify what you're observing. uh, but it helps to have these long-term data sets. So because they had that, they were able to apply models and hypotheses that were able to give a reasonably detailed hypothesis about what's going on.
I have a question that goes back to the beginning. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but you said in the beginning that the animals that were involved in what, eating the bugs or eating the lizards were not available because of the
Lag.
yeah. What animals are you speaking of? Birds or what?
Yeah. So are you referencing the last year's monsoon and the abundance of insects?
Yeah.
So
Crickets. I had a million crickets.
yeah, and actually there's still a lot of crickets around here.
Yeah.
And those are, you know, those are not native, so that they're associated with human dwellings. But you know, of course, the Sonoran Desert is so biodiverse, and with the insects, just like everything else, the species represent a convergence of multiple biotic regions that converge that are in the Sonoran Desert. And last year, what we saw was the more tropical species were not as prevalent down in the lowlands as the actual more arid adapted species that have adapted to withstand prolonged heat and drought, although they are still being pushed to those limits. But there was still a spike in insects that we all noticed. And I think the reason we noticed that was because not just abundance, but the fact that the things that eat those insects weren't in numbers that you would associate with such an abundance of food available to them. So just fewer insectivorous birds, fewer urban lizards. But it all comes down to what you're looking at and how you're looking at it and how you're measuring it and quantifying it. You know, this is all just personal observation. No one really actually was out there doing inventories. But having lived here my whole life, it's an observation that I make off record, of course, or without any measurements or anything like that. But yeah.
Well, we have, I think, I don't know how many people know on the call know how many species of lizard and everything we have in this desert. I mean, so you talked a bit about the impact on the overall ecology of the area. I mean, off balance in that sense. So first, numbers, we have a really munificent climate for these critters.
Yeah. So there's this great guide for those of you who are interested, and it's, you know, it's a thick book. And these are the lizards of the American Southwest, and they include northwestern Mexico in here. So let me see if I can get a quick number here for actual number of species. It's a couple hundred, I believe.
I can imagine, yeah. I don't see as many where I'm living now, but down by the university, I saw so many lizards. And I don't know if it's the weather or the changes in the past couple of years or location.
the rocks, all that rock architecture provides great lizard habitat. The basaltic construction of the houses and buildings there are perfect for lizards.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, so I won't try and tally these, but California has 43 species, with 6 found only within the state boundaries. Nevada has 22. Utah has 23, Colorado 19, with 1 found only in Colorado. Arizona has 53, with 5 only found in Arizona. New Mexico has 46, with 1 found only in New Mexico. Texas has 33. Chihuahua has 51, with 1 only found within that state. Sonora has 62, with 12 that are only found within the
That's
state.
great.
Baja California is 47, with 12 found only within that state. And Baja California Sur, 47, with 28 only found within that state.
They're fascinating to watch. And by the way, Robert said it was okay to ask questions. So if you have a question, unmute yourself. I'm going to let you do that. But can you tell me, I want to talk about other things, but one question I have is, what if they do little sit-ups? Oh, what does the little sit-ups mean? Is that a mating ritual when they do the little sit-ups?
Yeah, the sit-ups are typically done by males, and they represent territorial displays or assertion of dominance and dating advertisement. So they're displaying for all those purposes.
So when someone want to say something, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I see them do the little push-ups, but I was told that helps cool them down, so I was misinformed, obviously.
It could.
They're heating up.
Yeah, it could have that effect. If air is running under your body and it's really hot outside, it could help cool off your body. So that's probably a partial reason why they do that. Might be an incidental benefit, but lizards. One of them, I'm coming back to something in the paper, is that what we call thermal maxima, or the hottest a lizard can get. Each species has a different threshold, but they avoid those thermal maxima by moving into the shade, going underground. The most stable lizard species in the study was tree lizards, because they lived in trees which were associated with waterways, and so the microclimate or microhabitat was just generally a bit cooler, more air circulation, able to hide from the sun better. So the ornate tree lizard population seemed more or less to stabilize across different scenarios, whereas things that lived on the ground had more difficulty evading thermal maxima. So even in the shade, those temperatures were going up, and even hiding underground, the ground was still heating up beyond typical normal temperatures. And so when lizards heat up, they're losing water, if they have any at all in the first place. And this puts a big strain on their ability to be in the proper condition to breed, because they need resources, they need food resources, they need water resources. And they're just not going to get those if they're increasingly escaping from the heat. So yeah, and lizards, like I said, lizards that were late winter or winter spring active um, seemed to do, their numbers seemed to actually increase as spring and winter temperatures went up, because they have a much longer, greater thermal tolerance. They seem to be active. They're probably active in the spring, winter and spring, because a lot of the other lizards are not active. And they're actually ground dwelling. So the earth heats up sooner probably in the winter and spring. And so they're active. These have they just generally seem to benefit from warmer winters and springs. And then they tend to hide or away during the summer to some extent. But then the lizards that are active in this late spring and the summer, they have, like the whiptail lizards and things like that. They are active at really high temperatures typically, but we're reaching a point where even those temperatures are being pushed and distressing those animals. But Barbara Warren says she has a gazillion more lizards than ever this year, and that's great. Urban lizard habitats are great, because if you have vegetation, if you water your plants to any degree, you're basically creating like a giant sanctuary for lizards. But you're also, that also means that their predators are probably also being attracted, and cats and things like that. So urban centers superficially are beneficial to a lot of wildlife, but the trap is cars and roads and pets and things that are maybe thrown off balance because of an increase in water, or for example, a lot of saguaros around golf courses often die prematurely because they're being watered excessively. So there's root rot, or might be some damage that breaks the skin from cars or people, or an increase in rodents as well. Shoots up the snake population. An increase in insects brings in the toads and the lizards, but it's all relative when you consider the cost of all that, which is human impacts like cars and roads and things like that.
Are the warmer nights that are associated with climate change, is that also an impact on the lizards? They can't recover as quickly. I mean, does that affect them?
That's correct. Yeah. Warmer nighttime temperatures does physically stress lizards out. And there's another paper that suggests that all of this general increase in temperature also ages lizards prematurely from the point of embryonic development.
Wow.
Oh,
I do remember that. Yeah.
Another paper some years back looked at turtles. Well, the temperature at which turtle embryos were incubating. So first of all, something that hasn't been thoroughly investigated because it's a very sensitive subject, but the sex ratio of reptiles, for the most part, is influenced by the temperature at which the embryos develop in the egg. So on the cooler side of things, you'll get males. On the warmer side of things, you'll get females. And of course, then if you get just right in between, you get a mixed ratio, or you get a mixed clutch of sexes. But what this study was looking at is that they incubated turtle eggs at a normal warmer side range, and then they incubated the same species eggs at the threshold, as hot as they could get, and they turned out female, as everyone thought, but the females incubated at the highest temperatures had were neurologically, well, they took a longer time to right themselves when placed on their back than those that were incubated at a normal range of temperature. So there's physiological implications in that sense, and just if writing ability is any indication, young turtles that developed in the hotter temperature range took several seconds longer to upturn themselves or right themselves than turtles that were incubated in a normal temperature range.
What about the other, like snakes and tortoises and our other herps? How are they faring?
Well, I don't know. I don't think there's that much work done on tortoises and snakes. Lizards have always been a model organism for ecophysiological studies, because they're abundant. They for a number of reasons, they're just preferred. They behave more like mammals than, in some senses, not all senses, but they, tortoises have a I think like a 15-year generation time, and lizards have life cycles and life histories that are just generally easier to measure and quantify because they've been studied longer. And that's why there's entire books written on ecophysiology of lizards and the ecology of lizards. There's just a lot more information that's been gleaned from them for a longer amount of time. So yeah, I just attended a international freshwater turtle and tortoise conservation meeting here in Tucson. And there weren't too many studies that involved climate change. Mm-hmm. Mostly they're suffering from habitat destruction and the illegal pet trade.
Oh.
But yes, rising sea levels do have are a significant threat for species that live on islands in the Indian Ocean, at least. So yeah.
Well,
lizards seem to be the go-to.
Well, they're so cute. They're so much fun to watch. And I have heard that you can actually make a pet out of a lizard, more like an animal.
Oh yeah, they're easy to tame in your own backyard. I know several people who feed their backyard lizards with mealworms and things like that.
As there's a question from Barbara. If you want to, do lizards carry any human pathogens? You said
only in captivity. So people who keep iguanas just need to wash their hands after handling them. But catching a lizard in your backyard, there's no risk. I just heard thunder, huh?
Oh, good.
Catching a lizard in your backyard is not dangerous unless it's a Gila monster. You got to leave them alone.
I was gonna ask, if the bigger the lizard, is it protected a bit from the elements? Like high heat? and
In
that
many
sort of
ways,
thing?
yeah, it can be. You know, when you get to a certain size as a lizard, it becomes more costly to maintain your body mass.
Oh,
And so, and it can take longer to heat up. If you
okay.
cool down in the winter time, it may take longer for your body to thoroughly warm up than a smaller lizard, which has smaller body mass.
Right.
It'll warm up a lot faster. So, yeah, let's see. Do they help reduce our risk to insect-borne infectious diseases? I haven't seen any numbers or any studies. I think in principle they should. Although mosquitoes are awful small, maybe hatchling lizards will go after mosquitoes. And ticks, they might actually a tick would be a fantastic food source for lizards actually. But I don't know. I can't say for sure if they reduce insect-borne infections.
So I think that can lead right into the toads.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we all are enamored by the toads and also understand how deadly they are to our dogs. But they're still, now start with, are they native to the Sonoran Desert?
Toads?
The Sonoran Desert toad?
Yeah. Yes. Actually, what I can do, if you're willing to spare 15 minutes, I can just present my PowerPoint on the toad.
Sure, sure, it'd be wonderful.
All right.
So there's a comment that the lizard
Yeah, bigger
Mary
than
sees,
other
yeah.
years. Yeah, they could be eating more insects this year. It also, what you might be noticing is that the bigger lizards are probably, because they're bigger, have more energy reserves. So they were able to bulk up from last monsoon season, and now you're seeing them this year. There's a little spiny lizard on my patio or porch here that has doubled in size since the beginning of the year. So, yeah.
Oh, one last quick question. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'm bugging this. It's an urban legend. When I was growing up here in Tucson, the saying was that cats that ate lizards in the summer were skinny. So, I don't know, but I see a lot of skinny cats, and I think, is that true? So,
It's probably it might, if I had to guess, it could have something to do with parasites. Yeah. Okay, let's
so
see.
don't eat lizards. Yeah, you're co-host, so you can go ahead. Great.
All right, so you already know about the THS. So of course, we are in the traditional lands of the O'odham people, the Sonoran Desert people, and several other diverse groups of people. Timamook Hill, where I work, is the O'odham, known in O'odham as Chamamag Duag, which means Horn Lizard Mountain. And across the valley is Babadak Duag, or Toad Sitting Mountain, also known as the Catalinas. But this is the west side of Push Peak. And I don't know if you can see the outline of a giant sitting toad. Push Peak is the tip of the snout. And then there's two rock formations, just one on each side, that represent the eyes. And I can Let's briefly draw that. Well,
That's amazing.
let's see. Right. Here's a parotid gland. There's another parotid gland. And there's little dimples to the back. There's a leg. And there you have it, the Sonoran Desert toad.
That's wonderful.
So this is our protagonist, Encilius alvarius. It's the largest amphibian in the Southwest. It's the largest amphibian in the United States. And what makes it a toad is this gland here. And toads are basically more terrestrial frogs. The males are distinguished by these blackened digits during mating season. And it's basically the amphibian version of a saguaro. It's endemic to the Sonoran Desert. It's found nowhere else. Here's a map. This is this yellow here represents the Sonoran Desert. And it has various subdivisions, and the range of the toad basically coincides with the Sonoran Desert. It's also known as Colorado River toad. It was collected by Arthur Schott on the banks of the Colorado River at Fort Yuma. I think it was the California side. And habitat alteration basically has removed that animal from where it was first collected for science. The type specimen, the one specimen that was collected that represents the entire species, is in Washington, D.C. under number 2572. We know surprisingly very little about the species. We know from unpublished reports that they can live between 15 to 20 years. And when they're not associated with human dwellings or spaces, they like to hide out in kangaroo rat burrow complexes. Here's one that my friend photographed. He was actually studying mud turtles. Whoops, excuse me. He was studying mud turtles and trying to figure out where they laid their eggs. And he found the egg of a mud turtle in here. And he's also found this toad guarding it like a troll. But this is what they sound like. This is a mating call. And they, of course, are laying dormant underground. They have porous skin, which they need to keep moist to stay alive. And so they wrap themselves in a cocoon of skin underground for 9 months out of the year. And then the noise, literally the sound of thunder and water hitting the ground causes these animals to come up to the surface. And they have this short window of time during the monsoon season to reproduce, eat, and then get back underground before things dry up. And so just like birds, each species has a different call to avoid hybridization or confusion. And so, but still it's dark. And if a male grabs another male, they have a release call, which sounds like a chicken pluck. So the Sonoran Desert toad genus is Encilius, and Encilius is otherwise a group of very tropical toads. found in Mexico and the Sierra Madre. So it's very unusual. It's sort of like the oddball, the black sheep of this otherwise tropical family of toads. And indeed, that's what characterizes the Sonoran Desert, is an abundance of species that either evolved from tropical ancestors or are tropical themselves. And they require more permanent, deeper bodies of water to reproduce because they have a long metamorphosis. And to me, this speaks to those tropical origins. They can lay well over 3,000 eggs. And ever since there's been electric lights in the desert, there have been toads attracted to those lights for the insects. They eat anything that will move in front of them, and they actually use their eyeballs to swallow their food. So they'll grab something with their tongue, it'll come into the mouth, and you'll notice that their eyes drop down into their sockets to help push the food down. But they eat centipedes, beetles with really caustic chemicals in them, other smaller toads. Their visual acuity is based on movement, essentially. But they do have their predators. Raccoons have been known to flip the toads on their backs to avoid all those toxic glands. This is an indigo snake eating one. Here's a badger running off with one. But so amphibians in general, and more specifically toads, they produce toxins through their skin, and this is basically very sophisticated sweat. Desert amphibians, and especially toads in general, had to figure out how to balance their water, their body water, for a new existence on land. And so just like you and I, that depend on the balance of sodium and potassium across our cell walls, our membranes, toads had to really find a sophisticated way of maintaining that. And so their sweat, so to speak, became a way of keeping water in, and also became one of their most successful defense mechanisms. And one of the chemicals, most active one in toads, is bufotenin. It's called bufotenin because it was found in toads. But it turns out that we have bufotenin. Plants have bufotenin. Bufotenin is a widespread chemical, and it's actually found in higher levels in people who have schizophrenia and autism. There are also these things called cardiac glycosides, which can relax heart muscles, sometimes permanently. And so ingesting these secretions orally, as this mural is suggesting, is actually quite dangerous. And it's why dogs and cats can die if they ingest too much of this. Usually it's good to just wash their mouths out with running water and call a vet. Usually they're just fine unless they ingest a large quantity of it. But where things get interesting is that the Sonoran Desert toad is the only toad and the only animal on Earth that produces 5-MeO-DMT from the parotid glands, that big lump behind the eye. And we don't know why. So whereas all the other toads produce bufotenin and cardiac glycosides from those large glands and the rest of its skin, the Sonoran Desert toad is the only toad and the only animal that produces 5-MeO-DMT from the parotid glands, and it's nearly pure.
Sounds like they're happy toads to me.
I don't speak toad, but perhaps. So there's nothing in the diet of this animal that is any different from other toads. It's these are just questions that might possibly hold the answer, but we really don't know. And how did we find this out? Well, it came out of a mistake. In 1981, there's these 3 paragraphs in Omni magazine. And essentially, this guy named Alan Maurer interviewed an archaeologist. This archaeologist found over 10,000 headless toad remains in a Cherokee archaeological site. And because the archaeologist knew that toads contain bufotenin, which is a mild psychedelic, that's what I forgot to mention, thought that these Cherokees must have been using the toads for psychedelic purposes. But it turns out much later on that the toads were used for food. Bufotenin is not active orally, so you can't take it up. It's a mild psychoactive, but it's not orally active through the mucous membranes, and it's not heat stable. So there simply wasn't technology that was able to extract the bufotenin from these toads. And these are not Sonoran Desert toads. The Sonoran Desert toads are in the Sonoran Desert. They're not in the Cherokee territory. So what I'm saying is that this archaeologist made a very careless assumption, and someone read this and thinking that there was some psychoactivity in toads skin chemistry, and he went to this book on the evolution in the genus Bufo, and there's a whole chapter in there on the chemistry of toad skin. And it turns out that the people who wrote that chapter built their careers on understanding the chemistry of amphibian skin. Well, he read this chapter, and there's a reference to these 2 notes on the right, which explicitly identify the Sonoran Desert toad as having 5-methoxy dimethyltryptamine, 5-MeO-DMT. Now, this was before the internet. This was in the 80s or late 70s. And so this person basically went through the stacks at the library and read these very technical articles, and realizing that 5-MeO-DMT is psychoactive and is heat stable, decided that he would drive to Arizona from Denton, Texas, and find a Sonoran Desert toad, squeeze out the parotid glands onto his windshield, and after they had dried, smoked it and had an incredibly transcendental experience. And he wrote this pamphlet in 1984. And this was an underground fringe activity until these very famous doctors were the first to report their experiences, personal experiences with this in 2 articles in academic journals. And in here, they go on to speculate that this must have been indigenous practice, that this must have been invented or discovered by indigenous people, when in fact it wasn't. There's no evidence for it. It was found by a guy named Ken Nelson in Denton, Texas. So without any evidence, these authors say this must have been something that indigenous people did. And in fact, there's lots of evidence that is very suggestive that it could that could have been the possibility. We have these incense burning vessels in the shapes of toads. Toads figure in Mesoamerican and pre-Hispanic cultures, but there's just no evidence that the Sonoran Desert toad was ever traded or used, or any toads were used in any psychedelic manner. These are clay vessels from, I think, either Argentina or Peru, or excuse me, Argentina or Chile, which mimic the local species of toads and frogs. We have kambo, which is the scraped skin secretions of a tree frog, which are not psychedelic, but are burned into the skin in order to facilitate hunting. After a severe purge, your blood pressure goes up and your senses are heightened, which aid in hunting of game in the forest. Sight and taste and feeling and such are all your senses are heightened as a side effect of having this burned into your skin. But it has no psychedelic properties. The Seri people in the Sonoran Desert always viewed toads as toxic and avoided eating them. But with this new wave of psychedelic demand on the toad, there's been a wave of charlatans and pseudo shamans that are charging lots of money to smoke the secretions of the Sonoran Desert toad. And it's going to have really bad repercussions for toads as well as people, because people have died from this. This is an open letter to 2 practitioners for malpractice. And the reason people do it is not just recreational. Smoking 5-MeO-DMT, whether it's from a toad or from any other source, can remove one's addiction to drugs. It can treat treatment-resistant depression. It can treat PTSD. But if the substance isn't properly or responsibly administered, it can do just as much damage as the things it's meant to eliminate. So what we know is that these toads are collected in large quantities, and their glands are expressed and collected. There's a number of problems with this. This is a great way to spread disease. The amphibian disease chytrid fungus. These animals are stressed, they're terrified, and they're often not returned to where they were found, which means that they're then lost, and they have a very low survival rate if they're lost. So it's just a whole number of things which are incompatible with the idea of sustainably sourced 5-MeO-DMT from Sonoran Desert toads. This is all very sordid. Everyone is basically in it for money, with the poster child of the treatment of substance abuse and such. This animal here has been severely abused and stimulated and over harvested. They generally don't make good pets, although there's a person in British Columbia and a person in Hungary they're breeding these animals, ostensibly to relieve the demand for wild toads, to relieve the demand and the trafficking of wild toads. There's an annual conference dedicated to this animal. Mike Tyson and the New York Post and Town and Country are reporting on this phenomenon, making the toad more and more popular. Terra Incognita is a psychedelics organization that attempted to sort of understand early on toad populations, but really didn't produce any sort of science whatsoever. They tried to sell something, they tried to sell the idea of fair trade toad, which again doesn't exist. And so basically the International Union for the Conservation of Nature lists this species as a species of least concern because there's no data available on it. In other words, people assumed that there were, or is, probably still is large, there's probably still are large quantities of toads on the landscape. And so they focus on things that are near extinction. And when they turn around, the things that they thought were abundant are starting to show signs of distress. And usually it's too late. So this is what we call a mortality sink or a vacuum, in which people harvest X amount of toads a season, and the surrounding toad populations fill in that vacuum and lead to a perception of abundance. But you have to think of the toad populations or local toad populations as a house of cards. You can get away each year by removing X amount of animals until the entire populations collapse. So really, we're working against time because we need a baseline. We need data from populations before the poaching and trafficking of these animals really ticked up, in order to define the intensity of the problem. So climate change and drought really affects our ability to measure what a healthy population is, because they're based on the availability of healthy rain cycles. Breeding these animals in captivity is just another opportunity for an amphibian disease outbreak. And it just ecologically just doesn't work. The substance is easily synthesized. We reissued the pamphlet and appended a laboratory synthesis of 5-MeO-DMT. There's lots of money around making proprietary versions of 5-MeO-DMT. And this company is actually cultured toad cells from the parotid gland that actually produce 5-MeO-DMT for people who insist that it must come from the toad, even though there's no basis for the suggestion that there's something different about 5-MeO-DMT coming from the toads. It's the same molecule, whether it comes from a toad or a laboratory, does the same, behaves the same way on your nervous system and your brain. And so all of this on top of all the challenges that the Sonoran Desert already faces, which is drought, climate change, the human growth and barriers imposed by those things. And so some facts for you to just recap was, it's a unique long-lived species found nowhere else. It's the only animal that produces 5-MeO-DMT that we know of. Its ancient use as a hallucinogen is speculative and inconclusive. We don't know why they produce 5-MeO-DMT. We need more research. We need to encourage people to use alternative sources of the drug, and begin to monitor and enforce monitor poaching and enforce protections, which are very difficult. It's very difficult to monitor an illegal activity. So what we have to do is measure the impacts of other things like climate change and population health, besides the poaching, in order to be able to say that poaching can't possibly be helping the species. So we've developed a conservation campaign, and we've raised money through the sale of merchandise to fund the Sonoran Desert Toad Fund, which we have at the Tucson Herp Society, and are currently better poising ourselves to collect better data. We only have about half a season worth of data from last season, and we need at least 3 seasons, preferably more than 5, to get an idea of the population status of these animals. And even then, we could be seeing that populations are fine over a huge range. Most of the Sonoran Desert, there are probably still lots of toads, but we need to continue monitoring over a long-term project to look at whether toads are actually will begin to decrease in areas where people are collecting them. So it's important that we sample these animals across their entire range in order to say, well, at these areas, perhaps where they're being trafficked, their populations are trending downward, perhaps, or there could be a higher incidence of disease. So we're not just looking at whether the animal is endangered across its entire range, but we really want to be able to say that trafficking these animals is detrimental.
Is it currently against the law right now for people to
No.
do this?
So, well, that's a tricky question, because in Arizona, with a fishing license, you can collect up to 10 Sonoran Desert toads, whether for pets or for whatever. You can collect up to 10 per year with a fishing license. However, if you're suspected of trafficking these animals or collecting them for the 5-MeO-DMT, then that becomes a federal offense, because it's a Schedule 1 narcotic. So it all comes down to the interpretation of the law. Those news articles will often cite, well, it's been extirpated from California and is an endangered species in New Mexico. But that's also mixed. That's a bit confusing. One, those are the edges of the range where their populations were lower anyways. The populations in California were more abundant, but they died out because of habitat change and extraction of water. And then in New Mexico, they're at the very edge of the Sonoran Desert, where they're not abundant. And that's not to say that it's not important to protect those animals, but there's a perception that they're rare, but it's because they're at the edge of their range. It doesn't have to do with poaching or habitat destruction necessarily. The other problem we have is that the bureaucracies and the administration, the rubrics that we implement to protect species often can be just as problematic. For example, the IUCN gives this species its lowest priority because it lacks data. Well, we probably want to protect things that lack data rather than deprioritize them. But in order to get any sort of listing above that within the IUCN or the Endangered Species Act, which is a federal US federal thing, or even in Mexico's endangered species list, you have to run through a very rigorous set of rubrics that in order to make recommendations beyond the question of the doubt that this animal should be protected. And that can, the amount of time that takes can be impeding. Let's say 5 years passes and we get data and we're able to make a qualified recommendation to Mexico's government. By that time, things could be far worse. And the recommendations that we recommended might need altering, but then more time to support those edits. So at this point, it's really public education that's going to be our most potent tool in getting people to leave these toads alone. And you can tell people what to do all day, but they're still going to do whatever they want to do. The trick lies in really convincing people that it's completely unnecessary to take this from the toads or use these toads for this purpose. But yeah, that's my talk.
Oh, well, that's wonderful and awful. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, it's a remarkable story.
Yeah.
It's it's a weird story of how it happened. You know, one scientist's misstatement led somebody to discover something which no one knew about until he did it.
And it's like, to me, it's so hypocritical that some people are seeking enlightenment at the you know, against the toad. I mean,
Right. Yeah, it's pretty ironic.
yeah. Well, anyway, this is so I had a link to, do you have a website or is it just through the Herp Society to get information?
Just through the Herp Society. I mean, I can type my email address if people want to ask me
Okay,
questions.
that'd be great. Because I think, yeah, like you said, and you know, I read the How to Change Your Mind, and that too. He was, you know, he's a well-known author, and I think he kind of apologize for it.
I don't know. I haven't read the book, and I heard
Yeah.
that there's a Netflix special now on
Oh,
it. I remember I was able to get mutual friends of ours to email him and say, just can't, please be careful about how you portray this.
yeah.
In his book, he really apparently had a really terrible experience. And so, you know, but ironically, again, that doesn't really deter people from doing it. The television program that I worked on that unfortunately launched this toad into popularity, despite my best efforts. You know, the opening sequence to that show depicts, it has people rolling on the ground and really having what appears to be an unpleasant time, and the look of terror on the host's face, but people still wanted to do it. So it's a Pandora's box. You're playing with people's imaginations and desire to escape the mundane or escape real problems like drug addiction.
That's right.
PTSD.
Well, they're doing that with psilocybin now, but I remember seeing, was that Hamilton? What was the name of it? Yeah, I remember seeing that, and people were really looked like having a really bad trip. I don't know why.
Yeah, you know, psilocybin is actually far more efficacious in treating PTSD and treatment-resistant depression, and they looked at getting off of cigarettes. You know, the nature of 5-MeO-DMT is extreme. You have what could best be described maybe as a near-death experience.
Mm.
And you have to ask yourself if that's really what you need. I mean, perhaps if you're at rock bottom, you do need something like that. But if you're trying to quit smoking or have PTSD or something, there are more effective psychedelic tools with more people who are equipped and experienced with administering those substances than 5-MeO-DMT, and
And
far more
destroying
effective.
habitats. Yeah, destroying habitats.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's fascinating. Any questions? Anybody have questions? I remember seeing a news report, and I think it was out of Phoenix, and it was a film clip of people with a big burlap bag full of, toads, and the newscaster said, "And look, those people are taking toads. I wonder why they're doing that." Sort of like, well, public education would be valued.
Yep.
Anyway, I think this has been a wonderful discussion, Robert. I'm really happy that you could come, and hope you're feeling better. I hope I didn't pull you out of
No, that's fine.
recovery to talk about, but you love the subject, so.
I love the subject, and it helps keep me entertained in my COVID quarantine.
Yeah, you can watch all the little lizards running around. Well, if there are any other questions, we'll say good night and thank you again. It's so good to see you. Like I said, I haven't seen you in a while, but
It's good to see you,
great to
and
see
thanks
you.
for having me. It's nice to meet you all. I hope
Thank
you all
you.
learned something.
Very interesting subject. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.